You don't have to spend all day every day in a gym. You don't have to spend even an hour a day. You can spend as little as 30 minutes a day. You can spend as little as 30 minutes a week, and you'll still get a benefit, and you're still going to be above someone who's not active in every instance.
Hi, Nate. It's my pleasure to have you on Evidence Strong Show for the second time. You blew my mind the first time, so I'm pretty sure it will be a repeat this time. Could you please briefly introduce yourself first?
Sure. Yeah. So my name's Dr. Nathan Serrano. It's a little bit weird saying doctor. I'm
Congratulations.
a recent graduate with my PhD. Thank you. So I'm here at the University of Arkansas in Northwest Arkansas, Fayetteville. And the lab I'm in is called the Molecular Muscle Mass Regulation Lab. We call it M3R because it's 3 M's. And so the work I'm doing now is with Dr. Kevin Murak. He's done a lot of work in skeletal muscle growth. And currently right now we're mainly focused on looking at hypertrophy. He's done a lot of work in what this opinion piece is about, looking at myonuclei, whether or not they're permanent or whether they go away, or this kind of idea of muscle memory.
All right, so I invited you because you have written a piece on muscle memory theory. So could we start with some kind of definition?
Sure. So this idea of muscle memory kind of stems from the idea that, kind of anecdotally, people that lift or do sports and participate in sports, we kind of noticed, or we've come to know that when you stop exercising and then you restart exercising, you tend to see some muscle growth a little bit quicker than when you first started. So for example, I weightlifted for, several years. And if you take, say, like 3 months off because you had a slight injury or whatever personal life experiences that happened to you, you take some time off and you get back into lifting, we generally tend to see the rebound to be relatively quick. And so we thought this idea of muscle memory is like that there's something there that's keeping track of our progress to get us back to that same point that we left off with.
The idea is when you stop and then you restart, you bounce back faster than you would expect this. So you're not starting from zero. That's basically what.
Right, and that's the general idea there, and I think a lot of people that have been around exercise, sports, or weightlifting kind of know that just from experience. When you take some time off or whatever for whatever reason, and you get back into it, yeah, you tend to bounce back a little bit quicker than you might expect.
So the follow-up question is why?
I mean, with anything, it's an pretty active field. So I think early on we thought that it had to do with this idea that the nuclei within your muscle cells. So muscle is pretty unique in that it has many nuclei. For most of the cells in our body, we're limited to one nuclei per cell. And so muscle cells, they have thousands of nuclei per muscle fiber. And so early on, we thought the memory came from those nuclei, and it does, but how we hold on to it is kind of a little bit more nuanced. And so early on, we thought, we can do these training studies. We look at the muscle, and sure enough, we see an increase in myonuclei, or the nuclei specific to the muscle fibers. And so we thought, okay, if the nuclei number is increasing, then that's what's giving us our memory, is we've just had more nuclei, and so they're able to kind of hold on to, quote unquote, the memory of where we were at in our training. And so we've done, I say we as collective scientists, because I haven't done this. So my mentor, he's done a lot of work in this area, and there's plenty of other scientists that have done way more of the work in this field. So I'm just kind of getting started there. But so we thought that myonuclei would kind of be key there. And so they run these training studies. And so the training studies actually showed in humans that we don't tend to really lose nuclei, or at least within the time scope that we tend to look at. There are some studies that show that you can lose the myonuclei during this period of detraining, right? So when you stop training, the number of myonuclei tend to go down. You see muscle atrophy. And so depending on how you design these studies, we can see the drop. So that means that the myonuclear number isn't necessarily the answer here. It might be part of it. We're not 100% sure yet for that, but there's also these other mechanisms that we think are probably more appropriate. And so we have, things like epigenetics. And so what the field of epigenetics is basically, we have DNA within all of our cells, right? And our DNA is more or less set in stone, right? So all the genes that we have are a result of, the combination of our parents and all the human DNA that came before them. But epigenetics is which of those genes is actually turned on or accessible to be turned on. And that can change depending on different processes. So we have what's called methylation. So you have these methyl groups that attach to your DNA, and they basically unravel or tighten your DNA so that when you have whatever stimulus, depending on your environment, then certain genes will either turn on or turn off. And so that I think is where we're heading in this field, is that the myonuclei, yes, adding more nuclei can definitely help you to kind of bounce back faster, but also the memory really is held within the epigenetics because the methylation tends to stick around. And so the memory within your DNA for basically telling which genes are able to be transcribed seems to be playing a larger role than the number of nuclei get.
Wow. So is it that we thought before that myonuclei are being built as you progress in your training? They are added to the muscle fibers. And then the stronger you get, the more hypertrophic the muscles get, the more nuclei you acquire. And then when you are going through detraining, they stick. But you say depending on the study design. So I assume depending on the period, how long that
Exactly. So depending on the length of the period that you're actually looking at detraining, so that like when does it start to dip down isn't super clear, and how long do they hold on to this quote unquote memory is also not super clear. So for human data, these studies are pretty tough to run, right? Because you have to gather people, you have to train them, and hopefully they're not previously trained, right? So they have to be pretty novice training, and then you train them for 3 months. That in itself is a feat. And then you have to detrain them, make sure that they stick around and that they're not actually trained during that detraining period. And that can go from, 1 month, 3 months, 6 months, and then you have to retrain them. So that's a lot of time, right? So you have to put in 9 months to like a year or longer to really do a study like this. And we've done these studies, and they're definitely out there, but they're very, very few. And so the information we can really gather and then apply on a grand scale is a little bit limited. But with that said, we do see that with training and within novice individuals, we see that increase in the myonuclei. And generally speaking, when we look at hypertrophy, what's happening is we have the addition of myonuclei into the muscle fiber, and that basically donates the capacity to build more proteins and send more signals, not only for further hypertrophy, but also to repair the muscle tissue. So the larger the muscle gets, the more nuclei you need to then repair that muscle. And so adding nuclei is very beneficial in that sense. And so as we detrain, we tend to see muscles get smaller, and we do see a bit of a fiber type specific loss in some nuclei. And so it seems that the fast fiber types tend to drop nuclei a little bit quicker or sooner. And so that kind of goes back to some of the work that I did in my previous lab and even in my master's work, where we're looking at fiber types, both in weightlifters and just kind of general population. These fast fiber types seem to be pretty important. And depending on which fast fiber types you're looking at, they have different kind of, not side effects, but they are different. So we have 2X fibers, right? So generally speaking, we don't really see 2X fibers in humans, but we do see a lot of these 2As, and 2As seem to be very beneficial, mainly because they share some metabolic properties that are both, sugar breakdown properties and also fat breakdown properties, where we don't see with 2X. And then with our slow fiber types, they're mostly just kind of fat burning machines. And so as we age, but also with like strength athletes, we see more of these 2As and a lot less of these 2Xs. And so with detraining, we tend to see an increase in what are called hybrids. And these hybrids are, generally speaking, 2A, 2X hybrids with detraining. So that means that the fiber types are actually shifting from 2A towards 2X mainly. And this is still hypothesis, and the field is trying to get the answer, but not really getting too much closer to it. Essentially, we think that the 2X fiber type is kind of the default expression when you're not moving or not stimulating the muscle tissue. It's interesting because within like human development, or I guess mammalian development, so all mammals tend to express 2X first within like their early development. And then as they become more ambulatory or start moving around, then we start to develop the different fiber types. And so within sedentary or quote unquote detraining, right? So if you're injured or whatever, you're on bed rest or you can't walk because you broke your foot or whatever it is, then you're not stimulating that muscle tissue the same way that you were before. You're not sending neural signals to the muscle tissue, which motor units tend to drive, at least in part, some of the fiber type adaptations. And so the less firing you have there, the less stimulation you have to either have that 2A or type 1 muscle fiber. And so you tend to express 2X kind of by default. Yeah.
Can I just stop for a moment? Because it sounds like 2x is, I would say harshly, it's a bad option.
Yeah. And I struggle to say that it's like a bad fiber type because
What are consequences metabolically for having a huge number of 2x? You said 2a, very good in burning both sugars and fat. So what 2x is doing that we know exercise is good. It is good metabolically for the body. So I assume there is a connection there.
yeah, so 2X it's an interesting one because it's mostly sugar utilizing. It has almost no ability to really process fats. And if you look at muscles that express a lot of these 2Xs, they tend to not have a whole lot of mitochondria, which means that they're not producing a whole lot of energy for themselves, but they burn through that energy pretty quickly because they're rapidly contracting. So whatever energy sources that they do have, they burn through them pretty quickly. And so essentially they're mainly relying on like glycogen stores, so sugar stores within your muscle tissue that they will then burn for contraction. And this is where I get a little bit hung up because I don't want to say that they're necessarily bad. They have their role in human physiology, obviously, otherwise we wouldn't have them, right? We just don't fully understand what their use is yet because they tend to come up by default. They also tend to come up when we're inactive. Some people that are high performers do express some of these pure type 2Xs. The case that always comes to mind is a world champion hurdler. This was back in like 2001 maybe, or early 2000, I forget the year, but a group at Ball State basically got a world champion hurdler and they took biopsies from his leg and then they look at the fiber types and he expressed 24%, I believe, like pure type 2X, which is just unheard of. Why that was the case, I have no idea. Obviously, it's a case study, so that's not, it's not intended to be like, oh, if you're a world champion sprinter, like you're gonna have these fast 2Xs. That's not necessarily the case for everyone. But yeah, the 2X is interesting in that sense, but it's also interesting because when people are injured, say like a spinal cord injury, and they lose all neural input, they express these 2Xs as well. So are they detrimental? Potentially, yes. And I tend to lean towards they are generally metabolically disadvantageous, right? So we don't necessarily want a whole lot of these 2Xs because they don't allow you to really burn our normal fuel sources. And I say normal because we tend to rely on both glycogen and fat burning. Can you burn, I guess, protein? Sure. But that's also detrimental to muscle tissue overall. And I guess with that as well, you kind of start losing some of the other metabolic proteins, like your glucose transporting proteins that actually shuttle glucose from your bloodstream into your cells for either storage as glycogen or to use immediately for muscle contractions. Those tend to start to go away as well as we shift towards these 2Xs. So detrimental, yes. Bad isn't necessarily the right term, I think, but they're definitely not very beneficial to what we would term as normal metabolism.
I may make it up, but did you do some research with people with obesity, or was there something to it too?
Yeah, there are several ways to get to poor metabolism, right? So having an excess, it seems, an excess in not just calories, but an excess in sugar in your blood, as well as lipids in your blood. So as we eat high sugar, high fat diets, which is kind of our Western diet, or kind of what the most of the world is kind of getting used to at this point. And so when we have these super high calorie dense foods that are high in sugars, added sugars, I should add, not just sugar on itself because sugar is good. Just add in sugar and then excess in fats. That results in obviously higher blood glucose, also higher blood lipids. And that requires that insulin be secreted throughout your system to then bring all of that stuff into your tissues if you're not using it. And so this is where it becomes really detrimental to have a lot of blood glucose or high blood glucose and lipids, is that insulin is then increased for a long time because it takes a lot longer to actually shuttle in and store lipids from your blood. Oftentimes they stay in circulation as fatty acids. And that's kind of a part of where we get, our HDL and LDL from. And I think most people would understand what those are. And so those constantly in circulation seems to be detrimental to not just muscle tissue, but obviously the whole system. What tends to happen is we get low-grade inflammation, which is a pretty common or known kind of side effect or symptom of obesity. Is we have low-grade inflammation, meaning you're kind of walking around day to day with some level of inflammation, and inflammation is not good, right? So you're sending signals out to your body that there's some type of injury that needs correcting. And so you're constantly breaking down different proteins throughout your body. And so we start to lose the ability to actually shuttle in some of that blood sugar from the blood. And we also start to lose some of that ability to shuttle in some of the lipids from our blood, or we'll stop shuttling it into our muscle tissue and we start inserting it into, say, our liver for fatty liver disease. Fat tends to, if it's not going into the muscle cells, it'll go in between the muscle cells. So you get these fat droplets that is infiltrating into the muscle tissue itself and not necessarily the muscle cells for energy use. It's just there as storage. And that causes kind of further inflammation and interference to all the different signaling mechanisms that we generally have in a healthy muscle. And so that can also be pretty detrimental. It seems that there's potential for kind of a loss of some of these kind of muscle memory mechanisms within obesity as well. I'm saying that in the sense that we lose both the number of myonuclei in obesity. We also lose some of the DNA epigenetic markers that we know to be beneficial for kind of bouncing back quicker. But also in a general sense, obese individuals aren't exercising as much. It does happen, and there is a such thing as, a healthy obese individual. That might be controversial, but obese people can be metabolically healthy even with some excess fat. Obviously, there's a point there. We have thresholds of kind of body fat levels that is then deemed as healthy or not healthy. And it seems that some fat isn't the end of the world. And I think as a society, we would move a lot into a much better place if we stop demonizing moderate obesity, because I don't see the full harm in having some excess fat. Obviously, there's levels of it.
Okay, cheeky question. If you would have a person who is visually thin or thin-ish, does nothing though, sits in front of the computer the whole day and then in front of the TV for the rest of the day. So let's assume they have lots of 2x fibers, and then we have a person who stores a bit more fat, but they are exercising, doing strength training. They are a weightlifter, let's say. Their diet is meat, vegetables, lollies in the gym. Pretty okay diet. Maybe on the weekend they will have a takeout. Who will be metabolically healthier, you think?
Almost in every case, if they're doing some type of exercise, they're going to be more metabolically healthy.
Wow.
Even if you're thin and have a generally healthy diet, but you're mostly sedentary, you have a desk job and you spend the rest of your time in front of the TV, you're not stimulating we are highly adaptable beings, and we will adapt to be very, very efficient in whatever scenario we're in, right? So if your scenario is desk job and then spending the rest of your time in front of the TV, our metabolism is going to start to ramp down at some point. And then if you're eating generally healthy, that's great for, say, digestive purposes, I guess, but like you're not stimulating your muscle tissue, which is not, our muscle tissue is one of the most metabolic tissues that we have. And so when it comes to metabolism and we want to burn sugars and fats from our diets, that's not necessarily a one-to-one there, obviously, but to be quote unquote metabolically healthy and cardiovascularly healthy, we have to stress the system, right? So if you want to stress the system, you have to move. Your heart doesn't have a demand to pump harder and faster if you're just sitting. In the same case that your muscle tissue isn't going to grow or become stronger if you're not demanding that it lift something it's never lifted before. And that's generally what exercise is. It's pushing our bodies to do something that they haven't done before, so they can then adapt and then achieve that thing that it couldn't do at one point. And I think that's one of the most fascinating things about exercise and kind of the human body is how it adapts. And I think that, those two scenarios couldn't highlight that more, right? The person that is mostly sedentary, has an okay diet, is always going to have a similar level of metabolic health as someone who's obese and exercises a little bit. Person who's obese and exercises more than kind of the our general guidelines, which is like whatever it is, American Heart Association and like the American College of Sports Medicine have the guidelines set at like 150 minutes a week or something like that. So if you're hitting that, like you're probably going to be pretty healthy, definitely more healthy than someone who's sedentary.
Wow, this is huge. Okay, so could we go back a little bit to more methylation and epigenetics? And I would like you to explain a little bit more how the adaptation happens there and how long does it stay forever? How big of an investment? Because I think for the body, as you said, the body is adapting. So you challenge the body and then it adapts. If the adaptation costs a lot, it will stay for longer because it takes so much to build it up. So you said nuclei go away after some time. They stick around for some time because that's where we came from. So what happens with methylation?
Yeah, so with methylation, so we get hypermethylation, which means we have a lot of methyl groups around our DNA, and that tends to cover up some of the genetic codes that need to be expressed for whatever. So if, say, the genetic code for more muscle tissue is in this specific part of your DNA, we want to have a specific methylation pattern to make sure that those genetic codes are actually being revealed so that our bodies can then read your DNA and then send those signals out and then build those proteins, right? So the central dogma of biology states that, we go from DNA to RNA to proteins. And so our DNA stores all of that information. RNA is basically the signal or the transfer, or I would say maybe the blueprints, right? Blueprints are being sent out. And then we have a delivery system so that RNA is actually delivered to the tissues that they need to be delivered to. And then they're read and then built into proteins, right? And so that's kind of the central idea around epigenetics, is that we're not using specifically us, but our bodies are then making it easier or more accessible for certain genes to then be expressed. And that makes it easier for something like adaptations, right? So the more we exercise, those adaptations change our methylation patterns. And I'm sticking to methylation patterns because some hypermethylated regions will drop or downregulate genes, and hypomethylation regions will increase the expression of certain genes, and some downregulation is beneficial and some upregulation is beneficial, and vice versa, right? So
Both hypo and hyper methylations are good depending on the place where it happens.
yes, our general take is the patterns of hyper and hypomethylation is what's being held on to in muscle memory, at least in part. And so how long that pattern is sticking into our DNA, we're not really sure. And that's where we get into a little bit of more of the weeds. We have a lot less data to really say for sure how long. These timescales are very difficult to achieve. As I mentioned before, for the human data, you're looking at over a year of these individuals having to participate in a study like this. So this is where some animal work can actually be super beneficial, right? Because their lifespans are much shorter, and so we can do things in kind of a condensed time scale, but their lifespans are much faster, so they're turning over cells a little bit faster than we are, and so we can see kind of the progression in a similar but not a one-to-one ratio, obviously, so it doesn't transfer as well. And so some of the animal work that's been done has shown that yes, epigenetics is a portion of it, right? So the patterns of methylation for these different regions within our DNA to express certain genes are important. But again, it still isn't super clear. And I think we're probably getting pretty close to answering some of these questions, but we're not super clear on what that time scale is. But at the moment, I think it's still up in the air. We know muscle memory exists as a concept because we can see that these different methylation patterns are sticking for some time. We just don't know how long. And that's both in humans and some of the animal data.
The person is training, then they have a period they detrain. There, for some time, muscle nuclei will hold, and then methylation patterns will hold. Can we see that nuclei drop or start dying earlier than the methylation?
Yeah. Yeah, we definitely see that happening, which is kind of what brought us to think that, okay, well, if it's not necessarily the dropout or kind of dying off of some of the nuclei, but we're still seeing the bounce back. So then that means that the nuclei wasn't the answer, but there's still something acting, giving us that faster bounce back. So what is that? And so we were able to figure out that, it's in part this methylation patterning. There's also kind of, we build up some of the machinery. And so part of the machinery for gene expression is what are called ribosomes, or kind of the contract builders. They read the blueprints and then they kind of build all the proteins. And so the more ribosomes that we have in our bodies, then the more proteins we can pump out, right? The more blueprints we can read through and the more proteins we can build. And so the more we have of those, we think that increases our capacity to then drive more adaptation. But that's still a hypothesis. We see some hints of it here and there in certain studies, but I wouldn't say that is a sure thing just yet. And how long those stick around as an adaptation isn't super clear either. So I know I'm saying a lot of I don't know, but I think that's just where the field is at right now. Is like it's still very early, which is I think really fascinating. And it kind of gets into, we also mentioned in the paper, the impact towards like steroid use, right? So if myonuclear permanence or the addition of myonuclei into the muscle tissue, and do they stay? Like if that's true, and if that's a result of steroid use, then how can we make sporting fair for someone who's already been, convicted? It is probably not the right word, but
Sanctioned.
if they've already been sanctioned and then they're allowed to participate again, is it still fair, right? 'Cause if they're presumably still training, they haven't stopped. They may have stopped using the steroids, but are they still gaining the benefits from that? And it's the data's not clear, and it's a tough one to kind of parse out because we can't really do human studies on that. We can do case studies after the fact maybe, but most of those people aren't going to want to participate in a study like that anyways. So what we have to do is we have to do animal studies, and the animal studies aren't very translatable to human data in that case.
I have one more question. How about mitochondria?
What do you mean?
Because there were studies on powerlifters and weightlifters showing that years of strength and power specific training changes mitochondria, changes how big they are, how many of them you have. And mitochondria are responsible for energy production. So in the muscle specifically, we thinking expression of power and strength. So would sticking of mitochondria play a role in muscle memory?
So mitochondria they have their own DNA. So I'm completely speculating because I'm not well informed in the area for like the mitochondria as it relates to muscle memory, but I would think it probably has some degree of similarities to muscle nuclei, simply because mitochondria have their own DNA, but also they're like pretty robust organelles in our tissues, not just muscle tissue, but like they're pretty well adjusted, and they adapt fairly well. And like you mentioned, that there was that study that looked at weightlifters' mitochondria, and they had all these great adaptations, becoming more efficient essentially and larger. And so I would guess that it's got to play a role on some level. What that level might be is beyond me at the moment, so I couldn't say for sure.
I haven't seen any studies, because then you would have to take, if the changes in mitochondria are brought by years of training, then you have to ask this person who was training for years to stop training for another 2 or 3 years to show.
Right, exactly. To see that, you're not going to get that. But it is a very interesting question. So thanks.
I'm wondering whether doing any training, obviously I'm from the strength and power perspective more interested in that part, but training in general, could it be an investment for life? So doesn't matter when you start, doesn't matter do it for, but whatever you do, it stores in your body in one way or the other, and it's never wasted time.
Absolutely. I think any adaptation that we're driving, I think is going to be held on to at least in part. And so even, the smallest time frame, say you work out for a week and then you don't work out again for a few months, that week wasn't a waste of time. You started the process of some of these kind of muscle memory mechanisms to then store some of that adaptation, so that when you go back into training again, you'll kind of bounce back and get to where you were at. Now it might not feel like it because we always experience muscle soreness with that, but I guarantee you there's some level of of a faster adaptation. The after each repeated bout of exercise, you're storing some memory. How much of it is being stored, I don't know, but I don't think there's such thing as a wasted workout.
I read a study this week looking at comparing all-cause mortality and other health-related and healthy aging-related factors, and they looked at people who were training regularly, so let's say 5 times a week, and people who trained on the weekends, so weekend warriors, and did nothing during the week, and people who did nothing. And people who were weekend warriors, so they would do something on the weekend, not necessarily any other time, they were closer to people who were regularly training than to people who lifting. So
Yeah, I mean, for as long as I've been in school, and it's been a long time, we've been saying that, a little goes a long way, and it doesn't take very much to get there either. So yeah, I think that point of weekend warriors being just as healthy or metabolically fit as people that exercise more throughout the week. Yeah, you don't have to spend all day every day in a gym. You don't have to spend even an hour a day. You can spend as little as 30 minutes a day. You can spend as little as 30 minutes a week, and you'll still get a benefit, and you're still going to be above someone who's not active in every instance. So I think, yeah, like the 10,000 step rule is less of a goal to achieve and more a number to make people just more active in general. But even still, like, yeah, you can be a weekend warrior and be just as fit as most other individuals, which I think is a great message for a lot of people because it lowers the bar for a lot of people that might be, intimidated by exercise or demotivated because they can't spend, more than a couple days at the gym or whatever it is. Like it doesn't take a whole lot. You can do it once or twice a week and still get all the benefits, or at least most of them.
yes.
Everything we've talked about so far, I think, is directly beneficial to our weightlifting slash strength athlete. For those that are highly competitive and those are who are just recreationally competitive, I think muscle memory gives us a bit of an out, not necessarily like step away from the sport, but to maybe not take it as, I don't even want to say necessarily not to take it as seriously, but like if life happens, which life obviously happens to everybody, and you're either injured or you have other, family time or whatever it may be, and you have to step away from the sport, it's not the end of the world. And so I think that is a great benefit of all the work that was put in prior to that point, right? So we spend all of our time, and I spent the vast majority of like my teen years all the way through my 20s doing weightlifting and strength training really, really hard. And then my PhD came and I trained a lot less. And I can tell you now, even with not having been super consistent or really training at the same intensities as I was when I was doing weightlifting training, so doing higher intensity, say back squats or whatever, the snatches or the cleans, it comes back even a few years after not doing it. And so I think, yeah, the muscle memory is a strong adaptation. I think that we're still trying to understand in its entirety, but it's definitely a thing. It's definitely there. And I think it's this idea in the grand scheme, I think creates a bit, at least for myself, it creates a bit of a security to know that I don't have to be in there day to day. And if I miss a workout, it's not going to be the end of the world. And if I have to skip a week to a month, or if I have to take a year off because I'm whatever, for whatever reason, like I can always go back to it and I'll bounce back. And so oftentimes so it's interesting because some of these studies that look at like the shorter term detraining periods, we tend to see a bounce back that's higher than the previous sort of threshold, right? So you train and you get to a level, you detrain, and then when you come back, you're a little bit higher. And so I think that speaks volumes to letting your body kind of readjust and heal from all the little minor aches and pains that we all build up with high intensity training. And so, yeah, I think it's a great tool to use, and also just a great piece of information to remember and remind yourself that like you're always going to be able to bounce back.
That's a great message. We should cut it here.
Yeah.
Finish on the
On a good high note. Yeah.
yes. Okay, 2 short questions to finish. The first one is, what is your favorite exercise at the moment? I hope you had one.
Oh, one? Oh, I don't know anybody who's in exercise that has one favorite exercise. So my right now, or I guess for the last several years, my main exercise hobby has been rock climbing. I've shifted a little bit from weightlifting to being more rock climbing. I still do weightlifting, and I've recently started getting back into it, which has been exciting, doing snatches and clean and jerks and stuff like that in the gym. But having done it for over a decade, a little over a decade, like I needed something different. A being that needs kind of phases of hobbies. So right now, rock climbing is a hobby, but I still weightlift quite a bit. But if you're asking for like a particular exercise, I would always say back squats because they're my favorite. I prefer to train legs. Almost every day is leg day for me. So yeah.
Awesome. Okay, and where people can find you if they want to follow your research and see
Yeah.
what.
So I'm on Instagram. I don't post a whole lot. Now that it has a little repost thing, I definitely repost more research and I try to highlight any of the research that we're doing here there. And my handle there is Dr. Nate Serrano. I think there's a hyphen in there. It's like Dr. hyphen Nate Serrano. We'll post it somewhere. I'm sure.
Yeah, it will.
And then I'm on Blue Sky as Dr. Nate Serrano as well.
Awesome. Thank you, Nate.
Yep.
It was a pleasure.
Yep. Thank you.